He touched me in the attic, and I didn't want him to stop. I was 59 when I realized I had been asleep for most of my life. Not literally, of course. I'd lived, worked, married, buried, survived. But I hadn't felt alive, not since before William passed. His death 10 years ago had dimmed something inside me, a light I didn't think would ever flicker back on. I was a widow, a grandmother, a woman people barely noticed anymore when I walked into a room. But what no one tells you is that desire doesn't have an expiration date, and grief, it doesn't erase the part of you that still craves to be seen, touched, wanted. It was a dusty afternoon in early spring when I decided on a whim to open the attic door. The air was thick with dust and the scent of long-forgotten things. I hadn't been up there in over a decade, not since William died. That space had become sacred and sad, like a shrine to a life that no longer felt like mine. I didn't expect to feel anything. But I was wrong, and I didn't expect him to show up while I was lost in those memories. Ethan, my step-grandson, was 29, strong, confident, with eyes that saw everything. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he'd moved for work. But when he appeared in that attic doorway holding a coffee and wearing that easy, familiar smile, something strange stirred in me. It started innocently enough, a photo album, old memories, shared laughter. But somewhere between the faded pages and his quiet glances, a boundary blurred. His compliments felt deeper than politeness. His gaze lingered a little too long. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. And that terrified me more than anything. Because the moment he said, "You look stunning," I knew I was about to make a choice that would change everything. And I didn't know if I was brave enough to stop it. The rest of that afternoon passed in a haze of nostalgia and polite conversation. Ethan stayed with me in the attic, flipping through old photo albums and asking questions that brought the past back to life in startling detail. He was thoughtful and curious, his voice low and warm, and I found myself answering questions I hadn't thought about in years, about William, about my youth, about the dreams I used to have. It was like speaking to someone who actually wanted to know who I was beneath the layers of time and grief. At some point, we lost track of time. The sun had dipped low, and shadows stretched across the floor when I finally suggested we go downstairs. Ethan offered to bring down a few boxes and made quick work of lifting them with ease. I watched him, his strength, his ease of movement, the way he smiled when he caught me staring. He didn't say anything, but something had shifted between us. That evening, we sat in the kitchen drinking tea. The photo album was between us on the table, open to the picture of me on the beach in the yellow bikini. Ethan's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the page. "You were really something," he said, looking at me instead of the photo. I felt a flush creep up my neck. "We all had our moments," I murmured, trying to brush it off. He didn't smile. "No, Grace, I mean it. You still are." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, low, honest, unwavering. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing his voice in my head, seeing his eyes lingering on my face, like he was seeing something I hadn't seen in myself for decades. I tried to dismiss it, tried to tell myself I was reading into things, that it was just a young man being kind to an old woman who'd lived too long in silence. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, Ethan returned. He said he'd taken a few days off and figured I could use help sorting the attic. I should have told him no. I should have put a stop to the whole thing, but I didn't. I told myself it was harmless, that it felt good to have company, to feel like someone wanted to be near me, so I said yes. The days blurred into a strange rhythm. We'd work for hours sorting through William's old tools, my keepsakes boxes filled with forgotten letters and childhood art. And always we'd find ourselves pausing to talk, to laugh, to share things we hadn't said aloud in years. He told me about his loneliness, how despite the friends and job he felt adrift. He confessed he'd always admired me even when he was younger, but never thought I saw him as anything other than a boy. And I didn't know how to tell him the truth, that somewhere along the way I'd started looking at him differently. That it wasn't just the way he looked in a t-shirt or the shape of his jaw, it was the way he listened, the way he made me feel like Grace again, not just Grandma or Mrs. Carter. One afternoon, I found my old emerald dress in a cedar chest. It was a relic from my 20s, low-cut, cinched at the waist with a slit that had once made William blush. Ethan saw it in my hands and raised his eyebrows. "You should try it on." I laughed. "It won't fit. There's only one way to find out." Something in his voice wasn't playful. It was gentle, sincere. I stared at the dress torn, and then, without a word, I took it and went upstairs. I hadn't worn anything like it in years. But somehow, miraculously, it still fit. The fabric hugged my curves in all the right places, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself I thought had died with William. When I stepped back into the kitchen, Ethan stood and stared, his mouth parted slightly. "You're breathtaking." That was the moment everything broke open. I should have walked away. I should have laughed, said something lighthearted, changed the subject. Instead, I stood there letting his eyes drink me in. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt beautiful. He took a step closer. His hand brushed mine. And before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch. We didn't kiss. Not then. But the air between us was thick with unspoken things. My heart beat in my chest like it belonged to someone younger, someone bolder, someone alive. That night I sat in the dark living room, the photo album open in my lap, remembering what it felt like to be wild, free, unashamed. And I thought of Ethan. I should have known what was coming. I should have seen the signs. But what happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was simply the inevitable. The next morning I awoke to the scent of fresh coffee. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. But when I came downstairs in my robe, I found Ethan in the kitchen, humming softly, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Hope you don't mind," he said without turning. "I remembered you always liked it black with a touch of cinnamon." I hadn't even told him that. He remembered from years ago. It was the kind of detail you don't expect someone to carry with them, especially not someone so much younger. Someone who should have been focused on his own world. Yet here he was in my kitchen, grounding me in a moment that felt increasingly surreal. "Thank you," I said softly, accepting the cup. We sat across from each other in the sun-dappled kitchen, sipping quietly. I felt his eyes on me even when he didn't speak. The air was thick with something unspoken, and I could feel the pull, the slow magnetic current between us that neither of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. "Grace," he said after a long pause, "do you ever think it's possible to miss someone you're sitting right in front of?" The question lingered between us. I didn't know how to answer, so I looked at him, really looked at the way his jaw clenched with nerves, the way his fingers traced the rim of the mug. I think I finally said, "Some people make you feel like you've been waiting your whole life to be seen." He nodded. "And once you are, you can't go back." After breakfast, we returned to the attic, but we didn't do much cleaning. We sat on the floor, surrounded by forgotten trinkets, talking for hours. The conversation turned more personal. He asked me about William, how we met, what I loved most about him. He was kind, I said. Loyal, steady. The kind of man who made you feel safe. But did he make you feel alive? I blinked. That's a cruel question. I don't mean it to be. I wonder sometimes if we mistake safety for happiness. I didn't answer, because maybe deep down I'd wondered that too. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. Ethan stayed in the guest room, helped with meals, carried heavy boxes, and made me laugh in ways I hadn't laughed in years. But it wasn't just the jokes, it was the way he paid attention, the way he sat beside me on the couch, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm against mine, the way he would look at me when he thought I wasn't watching. One evening while I was washing dishes, I felt his presence behind me. He didn't speak at first, just placed his hands gently on my shoulders, thumbs grazing the base of my neck. "You always carry the weight right here," he murmured. I froze. Every nerve in my body lit up. "You don't have to anymore." The next thing I knew, his hands were guiding me away from the sink, turning me toward him. His eyes searched mine, asking 1,000 questions without saying a word. And for once, I didn't have the answers. He leaned forward slowly, giving me every chance to stop it. But I didn't. When our lips met, It was like stepping into a memory I hadn't lived yet, like rediscovering a piece of myself I thought had long since died. The kiss wasn't hurried or aggressive. It was slow, reverent aching, and when we finally pulled apart, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, breathing the same air, our foreheads touching. That night I couldn't sleep. It wasn't guilt that kept me awake, it was fear. Not of what we'd done, but of what it meant. Of what would happen if we let this continue. Of what the world would say. Because the world always has something to say, doesn't it? When I told Ethan we needed to stop, he didn't argue. "I understand," he said. "But I want you to know. I meant it. Every second of it." I believed him, but that didn't make it easier. Over the next week, he kept his distance. He still came by to help, still smiled politely, still asked about my day. But the space between us grew, and I hated it. I hated the way it made me feel like I'd lost something precious just as I'd begun to grasp it. Then, one afternoon, I found a letter in an old box. It was from William, dated the year before he died. To Grace, it read, "For when you forget who you are." I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as I opened it. "You have always been the bravest person I know," he wrote. "You have given everything to this family to me. But don't lose yourself, Grace. Don't let the world define your joy. If I'm gone and you find someone who makes you feel again, love them. Don't let the past become your prison." I cried for a long time after that. And when I looked up, Ethan was in the doorway. He hadn't said a word, but the look on his face told me he'd read every line over my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I whispered. But I did know. I was tired of pretending. We didn't fall into bed that night. That came later. What came first was a conversation. A long one. About what this meant. About who we were. About what we were willing to risk. "You're not just older," he said. "You're the most alive person I've ever met. I don't want to hurt anyone. You're not. You're healing." I didn't recognize myself in the mirror the next morning, but not because I looked different, because I felt different. For the first time in decades, I saw someone who still had life left in her, someone who wasn't finished. Of course the world didn't understand. When the whispers began, they were sharp, judgmental, cruel. One neighbor saw him leaving my house late and decided the worst. From there, it spread like wildfire. By the time my daughter Claire found out, the rumors were already poison in her mouth. "He was practically a child when he first came into our lives," she shouted. "He's not a child anymore," I said softly. "But you're his grandmother, step-grandmother," I corrected. "There's no blood between us. And more importantly, he's the one who sees me." She didn't understand. Not then. But in time she saw how I smiled again, how I moved lighter, laughed more freely. She started to visit again. At first reluctantly, then more often. One afternoon she stayed behind after dinner. We sat on the porch watching the sky turn gold. "I was angry," she admitted. "I didn't want to see you hurt, but you don't look hurt. You look alive." "I am." That was the beginning of her forgiveness. The rest of the world took longer. Some people never came around. Others surprised me. Friends I hadn't seen in years called to say they supported me. One even laughed and said, "You always had good taste, Grace." And Ethan, he never faltered. He stood by me even when it was hard, even when I tried to push him away. He reminded me that love doesn't come wrapped in perfect packages or timelines. Sometimes it shows up in the form of someone you never expected, and it changes everything. If there was a moment I could point to where everything changed for good, where the tides stopped pulling us back and finally surged forward, it was the day we danced in the kitchen. It was a quiet Sunday. I had just finished making lemon bars, and Ethan was teasing me about always using too much zest. I swatted him with the dish towel, laughing, and he grabbed my wrist. Then, before I could protest, he pulled me close and started humming a slow tune, one of those old jazz standards my mother used to play on the radio. "I don't know how to dance to this," I said, my smile faltering as the moment began to feel too intimate, too close to the truth. "Yes, you do," he whispered. "You just forgot." And then he moved with me, gentle, slow, guiding my body like it still remembered. and it did. Somewhere buried beneath decades of grief, obligation, and self-denial, the woman I used to be stirred awake. I laid my head on his shoulder, let my eyes close, and for once I didn't push away the warmth. I let it in. "You make me feel like I'm 30 again," I whispered. He chuckled. "Good, because I don't care how old you are. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." From then on, we didn't hide anymore, not from each other at least. The world outside still bristled with its judgments, its rigid norms and biting whispers. But inside the walls of my home, we built something real, something ours. We took walks by the river. We started reading to each other at night, something I hadn't done since William was alive. I introduced Ethan to my favorite old films, and he showed me how to use streaming apps. We made dinner together, cleaned out closets, even planted an herb garden. It was ordinary, and it was extraordinary. But life, of course, is never just moments of sunlight. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the rain, Ethan turned to me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "My mother wants to visit," he said. I tensed. "Does she know?" Not everything he said carefully. "But she's suspicious. And she's coming." I nodded. "Okay. Then we meet her together." When Dana arrived, she was cordial but tight-lipped. She hugged Ethan, shook my hand, and for the next hour we made awkward small talk about weatherwork and family. Then she asked to speak to me privately. I led her into the kitchen. She wasted no time. "You raised him, Grace. Maybe not from birth, but you were there." "How do you not see how wrong this is? I never raised him," I said softly. "He was already grown when his father married me. I never saw him as a child. And I certainly never imagined we'd become close. But we did. And I can't pretend it didn't happen." Dana shook her head, disbelief painted across her face. "People will judge you. They already are." "I know. But they don't live my life. They don't know the silence I slept beside for 10 years after William died. They don't know the loneliness. And Ethan, he's young, he's not a boy. He's a man. And he chose me." That silenced her. She left the next morning, her expression unreadable. Ethan later told me she hadn't given her blessing, but she hadn't condemned him either. "That's the most I could hope for," he admitted. As the months rolled on, so did the challenges. An old friend stopped calling. The pastor at our church gave a sermon that felt a little too pointed. Even at the grocery store, people looked twice. But others came out of the woodwork, too. A woman I barely knew from my book club pulled me aside and whispered, "I think it's brave. I think it's beautiful." Little by little, the shame unraveled. Claire, my daughter, became my greatest surprise. She began inviting us to family dinners. At first, Ethan kept his distance, always helping in the kitchen or playing with the grandkids. He never tried to take up space. But over time, Claire softened. One night, she handed Ethan a beer and said, "Don't let Mom hog the remote anymore." It was small, but it meant everything. That fall, Ethan planned a trip for my birthday. A cabin in the mountains, just the two of us. It felt like stepping into a dream I didn't think I was allowed to have. We hiked trails covered in gold leaves. We made cocoa at night. And one evening, wrapped in blankets under the stars, he pulled out a small box. "I don't need a ceremony," he said, voice low. "I don't even need a title, but I want to give you something. Because you've given me everything." Inside the box was a simple ring. Silver with a single sapphire. "For the woman who taught me how to love," he said. I cried. Of course I did. We didn't call it an engagement. We didn't need to. It was a promise, a quiet one. And it was enough. Winter came, and with it more conversations. About moving in, about long-term plans, about how we'd navigate holidays, family health. Some of it was scary. I was nearly 60. He was barely into his 30s. What if I got sick? What if he changed his mind? What if this didn't last? But the truth is, all love is a gamble. Even the ones that look perfect on paper. What we had was imperfect, but it was honest. We took a trip to the beach that spring, the same beach from the photo in the yellow bikini. I wore a different suit this time, more modest, more appropriate, but I stood in the same place. And when Ethan snapped a photo, I saw myself again, not as I was, but as I had become. Weathered wiser, still beautiful, and this time, not alone. We framed that picture and placed it on the mantel right next to the one of me and William, not to replace it, but to stand beside it. Because love, I had learned, is not a finite resource. It evolves. It expands. It redefines itself if you let it. By the end of that year, most people in our lives had made their peace with us, or at least learned to stay quiet. We weren't loud about our relationship, but we weren't hiding anymore either. At the community center's spring fundraiser, Ethan held my hand in public for the first time. The world didn't end. Some people stared, others smiled, and when the music started, he pulled me onto the dance floor. "You're doing it again," I said, laughing. "Doing what?" "Making me remember who I am." He kissed my cheek. "Then I'll keep doing it for the rest of my life." And as we danced me in his arms, the room spinning gently around us, I felt it. Peace. Not the absence of chaos or challenge, but the presence of something steady, real, earned. When I look back on it now, it all feels like a second life, one I never thought I'd be bold enough to live. There's the version of me that played it safe, who mourned in silence, who accepted the grayness of each day because she believed the vibrant parts were over. Then there's the woman I became, the woman Ethan helped me rediscover. Not a different person, just the truest version of myself finally uncovered after years of forgetting. Love didn't find me in a grand ballroom or under a springtime sunset. It found me in a dusty attic buried beneath boxes of memories and years of silence. It found me in the form of someone I never expected, someone who saw me not as a shadow of who I was, but as someone still becoming. People will say what they want. They always do. And for a while, I let that noise write the rules of my life. I let fear dictate what joy I was allowed to feel. I let shame shrink me, but not anymore. This wasn't a conventional love story. We crossed lines, we faced judgment, we broke open the idea of what's right and asked a harder question: what's real? Real is standing in your kitchen at 11 p.m. laughing over burnt cookies because he still insists the timer is too loud. Real is holding each other when the world feels too harsh. Real is building something sacred from the ashes of grief and memory. So if you're watching this and wondering if you're too old, too broken, too far gone to feel love again, don't believe that lie. Don't let society's timeline dictate the rhythm of your heart. Your story isn't finished. Not if you still wake up with breath in your lungs and longing in your bones. Because sometimes the second chapter is the one that finally tells the truth. And sometimes the person you never imagined becomes the one who teaches you how to live again. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was this story a shocking twist of fate or a bold kind of love that challenged what we've been taught to believe? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have chosen what Grace did or turned away? Let's talk about it without shame. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or reflect in any way, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that dare to go deeper. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the moments that matter. Because sometimes the most unexpected stories are the ones that show us what it means to truly live. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, be bold, be kind, and never stop becoming who you really are.